Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Terumos, chapter 1, Halacha 1 in the Art Scroll. We're on page 5A1. This is part 5 of this year. Today we are getting into the different categories of somebody who is going to separate Truma from something that is not his or hers. There are different categories of things that might not belong to you. For instance, temple property, hekdesh. Or what about if you are the administrator for a trust for orphans? Well, you may have control of that property for now, but that's not really yours. And also what happens if you have a partnership like two farmers, and can you separate the truma on behalf of your partner if your partner doesn't know about it? What about that? So today I want to dedicate this year to the elevation of the soul of Rabbi Kanievsky. I went to his funeral yesterday, and Rabbi Kanievsky, really, you can't understand what a great he was without going through his Derech Emunah or Beur. We use that in the shiurim a lot. The Yerushalmi is a very hard text to understand, and the commentary he gives is always refreshing. It is clear, it is insightful, and we really can't understand the treasure that we lost when Rabbi Kanievsky passed away. People tell a lot of incredible stories about him, but that doesn't really reveal the depth of Rabbi Kanievsky. Rabbi Kanievsky was like a Rashi or a Tosfot who gave us clear prushim and explanations about the Shas. And that is something that is a treasure to every Jew. Now, even if you are not that interested in learning the Yerushalmi, well, maybe your grandchild will be. Maybe your great-grandchild will be. And the odds are they're going to open up the book in a long time from now, and they will still be using Rabbi Kanievsky's insights because they are so timeless and really so deep and insightful and really bring a lot of clarity to a very difficult to understand text, and he will be missed. So the Mishnah talked about the different categories of someone whose truma separation is not going to be valid. Today we are going to deal with something which is not his. That's what the Mishnah says. One who separates truma from that which is not his is not valid.
The shear here, and the baby is a little bit noisy today, so we're going to finish it up here. The Brisa is going to move on, and it's going to explore this you. In other words, you shall separate your own tithe. Now, the Brisa it's coming up is also going to be in the Bavli and Kiddushin in page 41b. And it's breaking up from Scripture something interesting. It's breaking up three different parts of who this you could be. In other words, potential others that might be embedded within this that might not exactly have 100% ownership. And it might not exactly be obvious. So that's why there's a brisa on it. When Scripture says this brisa, you shall separate your own tithe, it implies you yourself. And this is to the exclusion of partners. In other words, if you have a partnership, well, what happens if one partner separates on behalf of another partner? Is that really going to be you? So that when, one person is trying to take out tevel produce, and that's, a grain pile that's owned by partners, and, is that going to say, hey, can one of them tithe the other person's share with his permission or not? So that's not exactly obvious without this you, and with the brisa to explain it. The brisa continues and says this, you shall separate, similarly implies you yourself to the exclusion of administrators or maybe trustees. An example of an administrator would be if orphans had property and there was an administrator to watch over that trust. And this is basically saying that the manager, this trustee, this administrator, is not supposed to tithe produce grown in their field because he doesn't really have ownership of it. He is just watching it. And the verse that this is pulling from in the Torah, this is going to be in Numbers 18:28, and the full verse is commanding the Levim, who are getting their Meiser Rishon, and it's saying over there, so shall you also separate the Truma of Hashem from all your tithes that you shall take from the children of Israel. This is talking about where the Levim are going to give 1/10 of their Meiser Rishon as Trumos Meiser to the Goan. Now, again, this is talking about Meiser Rishon, but this is being used to extrapolate to other tithes like Truma Gedola. The Brisa continues and says this, you shall separate. This is also going to apply you yourself to the exclusion of someone who separates Truma from produce that is not his. In other words, we're talking about a stranger who is going to tithe produce of someone else with whom he has no association. So imagine there's a grain pile and it belongs to Mr. X, and I walk by and I just tithe it, and I don't know Mr. X, but I know it belongs to Mr. X and I just tithe it. Was that a valid tithe or not? Well, this is saying no, because it is not you. I am not Mr. X, and I'm not his agent. So is that a valid grain pile? No, I didn't do anything. Basically, in that case, you would take the grain and you would put it back into the main part of the pile, and this does not have any sanctity. So the Gemara is going to look at the Brise's first clause where it was talking about this term you. What is this you teaching? And the Gemara is teaching that not partners. Okay, it's this you means not partners. And it says, we learned in a Mishnah elsewhere in Terumos 3:2 that regarding partners who separated Truma one after another, the sages say the Truma of the first partner is Truma in its entirety, both for his own share and his partner's share. So isn't that going to be a case where maybe one partner can separate not only for his own share, but also for the partner? And what's going on over here? Isn't that just like a sign-off on it? So the commentary by the Rosh is going to be that Rabbi Akiva in this Mishnah disagrees and rules that each partner can separate Truma only from his share, so that the Gemara, the question here is going to be based on the view of the sages over there. And so the Gemara is going to answer this and is going to say that there's really no contradiction. That here in this Baraisa, it's excluding partners from the Truma separation, and the Tana is referring to Truma Gedola, and this is saying that one partner cannot separate Truma Gedola for the share of the other partner. And here in the Mishnah, this is talking about partners for the Truma separation, and the Tana over there in 3:2 is going to be talking about Trumas Meiser. In other words, that one partner is able to remove that tithe for the share of the other. Now, why would that be? Well, first of all, the verse that we quoted in Numbers is talking about Trumas Meiser. It's not talking about Truma Gedola. So the difference, says the Rosh Cirilio, between these cases is that the amount of Truma Meiser is fixed at 1/10. By the way, that has to be precise. Whereas the amount of Truma Gedola is up to each person, and it's not precise. And so we know that there's a 1/40th or a 1/50th or a 1/60th amount. And also, it's also designed not to be exact. But the difference with Truma Meiser is that it has to be exact. And the reason it has to be exact, we covered this before in Masechet Demai, is that because it has to be 1/10, if you over tithe it, then the other part of the pile is left with a part that is untithed. And if you under tithe it, then the pile that you have has a part that is also untithed. So if you either over tithe it or under tithe it, either the main part of the pile has a little bit that's not tithed, or the smaller pile that you separated from has a portion that's not tithed. and because again, it has to be exact. Now, what's going on over here? Well, over here, we're seeing that the Truma Gedola, maybe I want to give 1/40th, but my partner only wants to give 1/60th. So how does that work? So that's, I think, part of the problem. In other words, it's presumed that one partner would automatically consent to have his fellow separate the Truma Meiser portion from his share, because that's a required part, but that's a measured part. And you can't know the Truma Gedola portion for his share over there because there's uncertainty. You're not sure. It can float. It's an approximation. So how do you know exactly how much he wants to take out? But the Gemara is going to reject this. And it's going to say, did they learn the exclusion of a partner in the case of Truma Gedola from anywhere other than the context of Trumas Meiser? No. The idea here, says the Pnei Moshe, is that the verse you, which is expounding to exclude a partner, is written in the context of Trumas Meiser, and the exclusion is extended from there to the case of Truma Gedola. Why? Because it's compared to Trumas Meiser. In other words, if a partner can actually separate Trumas Meiser, how can he also be excluded from separating out Truma Gedola? So the Rosh Cirilio is basically saying that there's a logical basis to treat Truma Gedola more stringently than Trumas Meiser, because in the source of Trumas Meiser, the term you does not come to exclude a partner. So how are you going to extrapolate this out over to Truma Gedola? So even in the absence of a specific scriptural exclusion, a partner should be precluded from separating Truma on his fellow's behalf. Why? Because the fellow might not want him to decide the amount of Truma. So maybe, again, maybe I'm going to be generous and he's going to be, more miserly about it. So how do you know? So the Mara Fulda is going to explain this as talking about that one partner can separate Trumas Meiser for the other, but he can't separate Truma Gedola for him. And the idea is that one partner cannot separate Trumas Meiser for the other, but he can separate Trumas Gedola. That's how some people understand it, because the verse excluding partners is stated in context of Trumas Meiser and not in the context of Truma Gedola. So again, the question is, you have two issues. One is going to be that the verse itself is talking about Trumas Meiser, not Trumas Gedola. And so maybe that's, going to be one way to read it. And the other way to look at it would be that, I might want to do one measurement for Truma Gedola, and he might want to do another. So I might either be under tithing or over tithing his property. So the Gemara is going to present an answer here. It's going to say here in the Mishnah, again, the difference between this Mishnah and the Brisa here in 1:1 and over there in 3:2 and Trumas 3:2. It says here in our Mishnah that validates the Truma separated by a partner, we refer to the letter of the law, and that the partner's Truma separation is going to be valid after the fact. And here in the Brisa, it's excluding a partner from separating Truma, and this is going to be referring to the actual practice. Initially, one partner should not separate Truma from the other without his express consent. So the Korban Ha'eda is saying that since one partner would happen to object to his fellow separating out the Truma, whether it's going to be Truma Gedola or Truma Meiser for his share, the Truma separation gets to be invalid. But the sages decreed, says the Mara Fulda, that one should not separate Truma for his partner without his express consent. And even if it is known that the partner does not mind, one should not rely on the presumed consent. And to avoid confusion in this case, where a partner objects to having his fellow separate for him, so that this Gemara is really talking about partners who separated Truma, referring to a law that pertains after the fact. And so Rabbi Kanievsky in his Beur is going to be saying that it should be noted from this explanation, this exposition of you is going to be to the exclusion of partners, and this is going to be in a smata. And so under the letter of the law, a partner can separate Truma Gedola and Truma Meiser from his fellow, but they're applying an asmata to limit it. So perhaps this is going to be a derabanan restriction. That's my own insight. The Gemara is going to look at the Bryce's second teaching about the administrators. And as you know, this Bryce has three parts to it. The first part we just covered with the partners, and the Bryce stated that the term you is teaching, not the administrators. So these are like trustees that are watching over the estate of orphans or minors. And it says, but we learned in a Mishnah, this is going to be in Gittin 5.4, page 52a of the Bavli, that if orphans relied on a householder to manage their affairs, or if their father appointed administrators for them, they are obligated to tithe the orphan's produce. So perhaps if we looked over that Mishnah over here, maybe the administrator can tithe produce for the orphan. So maybe it looks like there's a malokit between this Baraisa and what the Mishnah is saying. So how could that be? So the Gemara is going to answer what's going on here. The scholars said here in the Mishnah that's obligating the administrator to tithe the orphan's produce, we are dealing with a permanent administrator, whereas here in the Brisa we're talking about an administrator from tithing the orphan's produce, and we're dealing with a temporary administrator. So what's going on over here? That the idea is that there's, says Rosh Cirilio, a permanent administrator would be considered equivalent to an owner, since the orphan's property is completely under his control for the duration of the orphan's minority. And the Mara Fulda is saying that a temporary administrator is going to be considered like a stranger and therefore excluded from tithing their property. So the Gemara is going to object to this explanation, and Rabbi Yosei says that if the Mishnah is dealing with a permanent administrator, then it is reasonable that it was taught in a Baraisa regarding that, this case. In other words, that he may sell the orphan's movable possessions in order to raise funds with which to feed them, but he may not sell their real properties. So the idea is, maybe the Mishnah is referring to a permanent administrator over here, and in other words, saying that, maybe this permanent administrator cannot sell real property for the sake of providing food. In other words, maybe there's two kinds of administrators over here. And so the Rosh Cirilio is saying that a permanent administrator is certainly going to be empowered to provide for the orphans through any necessary means, since they're under his jurisdiction and no one else is appointed to care for them. So the Gemara is going to look at a different way to look at the difference between this Baraisa, that's going to exclude the administrators from tithing, and this Mishnah that's going to obligate them to tithe, to try to come up with a difference between these two and explain it. And the Gemara says like this: rather, here in this Baraisa, we are dealing with an orphan who is an adult, and here in that Mishnah in Gittin 5.4, we are talking about an orphan who is a minor. In other words, the administrator may tithe the orphan's produce only as long as he's a minor and has not yet reached adulthood. So the commentary here by Rabbi Kanievsky is that when the orphan is a minor and he lacks the ability to separate truma and maestros on his own, the administrator does it for him so that he should not feed him tevel. But once the orphan reaches adulthood, he's able to tithe his own produce, so that the administrator is no longer authorized to do it. And that's a really brilliant insight by Rabbi Kanievsky to reconcile this. So the Gemara is going to continue, and it says that the Gemara responds from this. Let us learn the answer from the Mishnah. This is going to be over in Terumos 6.2. So the Gemara is going to look at the Brice's final part of the teaching, where it says, you shall separate, implying you yourself. And this is going to be to the exclusion of someone who separates truma from produce that is not his. And the Gemara is going to examine the depth of this and try to look at the scope. How broad is this law? So the Gemara says, how do you apply with this exclusion? In other words, what precisely is excluded under the category of produce that is not his? And the Gemara says, is this going to refer to someone who separates truma from any produce that's not his, including even ownerless produce, such that if one separates truma from ownerless produce, it is not a valid truma? Or is this going to refer to one who separates truma from produce that is property of his fellow? But if someone separates truma from ownerless produce, is that going to be valid truma? Now, over in page 1314 in Baba Kama, we get into this idea of ownerless property. What happens if you have a bull that gores another person's property and the bull is ownerless? And then over there in Baba Kama, another person goes and acquires it and acquires this ownerless bull. How does the person recover damages? Well, he's not going to be able to recover damages because there's a change in ownership. And over here, we see a similarity to it. What happens if there's a pile of ownerless produce and someone separates out truma from it, and then somebody comes along and claims it? Somebody comes along and claims the main part of the pile. Well, over here, is that pile now going to be valid truma or not? So there's a lot of issues here with the change of property from ownerless to being owned. And so over there, in terms of damages, there's going to be an issue about that. And it's bringing up that there might be a similar issue with truma that gets separated from ownerless property. So the question over here is, one cannot make, any law take effect on hefker property. For example, one cannot consecrate hefker property to hektish, in other words, to become part of temple property. And, so how would he be able to make truma? And, the Vilna Goan is going to explain, the essence of this question like this. Is this verse meaning that in order to separate truma, one must actually own the produce? And if that's going to be the intention, then one cannot separate truma from ownerless and hefker property. Why? Because it's not the owner's. Or does this verse mean that one cannot separate truma from produce owned by another without his authorization? And if that's the case, then one cannot separate truma from hefker since no one else owns it. And, again, it's a different ownership structure. So the Gemara is going to try to look and reconcile at this, and it's going to basically be saying, does this refer to one who separates truma from any produce that is not his, or does it refer to one who separates truma from produce that is the property of his fellow? In other words, if one separates truma from ownerless produce, is that going to be valid? And again, the Vilna Gaon points out there's two ways to look at this, and the Gemara is going to look at the ramifications of this question. Again, how deep does this you go? That's what we want to know. So at the issue of this case, the Gemara says is going to be one who declared his pile of produce ownerless, and then he smoothed it, and then separated truma from it while it was ownerless, and then he goes and he reacquires it. Now, over in the case of Baba Kama on page 1314, that there's also going to be a case of you over there, where if the bull is it's your bull, right, and that goes and does damage. Well, in the case of ownerless, it doesn't really belong to anybody. So how does the person who has damage go and fix the damage? Well, normally he would go acquire the ownerless bull, and he would be fine. But if somebody else came and acquired it, how could a court come and take away the person's property, the new owner's property, because this was damaged when it was ownerless, and now it belongs to someone else? And so the Gemara over there in Baba Kama is saying that the person who's had the damage is precluded from doing anything now, because he can't collect, because he lost the opportunity to collect while the bull was ownerless, And effectively, if a bet din were to force this new person, this new owner, to relinquish the bull to settle it, you've effectively taken something away from this new party. So we have something over here that's very similar. Again, with this you, right? Over here we have Baba Kama, we have this you, your bull, and this is going to be you and your truma. And so there's a connection between this and this in the law. And so now you have, a pile of grain that's been declared ownerless. You went and smoothed it, and then you reacquired. What is the status of this, right? What do we do with it? So, again, we're getting back into these two questions. The Gemara says, if you apply the exclusion to one who separates truma from any produce that is not his, then his truma that he separated when the produce was ownerless is not valid truma, and he has to separate truma again after he acquires it. In other words, if you're going to be saying that, it has to be yours, well, and you declared it ownerless, it's not yours. So it belongs to somebody else, in this case, nobody. And in the second case, it says if you're going to apply the exclusion only to one who is separating truma from produce that is the property of his fellow, then his truma that he separated when the produce is ownerless is valid truma. And it should be maybe that there's no further separation. In other words, when we're saying that it's just talking about you, there's not talking about somebody who is separating from ownerless produce, because the other way to look at it would be saying, like, look, this is ownerless, and we're saying that you can only be precluded from someone who is an owner, and so it has to be tied. This property has to be tied to a specific person, and because it's not, in this case, if you're going to say like this, then you would say that it is going to be valid truma. Now, the Gemara is going to clear this up, and it's going to say, let us learn the answer from this Mishnah over in 6.2, and it's going to say, if someone stole truma of hektish and ate it, he pays 2/5, one for eating truma and one for eating hektish. In other words, the penalty for eating hektish, which is going to be owned by the temple and doing it on purpose, is a 1/5 penalty, and the penalty in the Torah of eating truma is a 1/5 penalty. So what is the penalty of doing truma that is going to be hektish as well? Well, he has to pay 2/5, 1/5 for eating truma, one for eating hektish. And the Gemara continues, and it says, but only one principle. So the Gemara says, because with hektish there's no twofold payment for theft. So the idea is that we have a kefil. A kefil is going to be like the punishment. So normally with theft of hektish, property does not generate a kefil payment, which is going to be like a penalty. And the Torah is going to state that he shall pay double to his fellow. And this is going to apply that it has to be owned by his fellow, not by temple property. So when somebody normally is going to go steal, and he's going to now eat it, he's going to uneat, unconsecrated truma belonging to a kohen, he has to make two principal payments. And so the question is over here, does he pay one principal payment or two? And the answer is, well, perhaps he just pays one. And why? Because hektish doesn't get a kefil payment on it because of the construction of how the Torah words it. So the Gemara says, because with hektish there is no twofold payment for theft, so someone who separated the truma from produce of hektish in the first place, was it not the temple treasurer? Surely it was. So if the temple treasurer does not own the produce, then neither does any other person. And in this way, he's kind of like an administrator. So we would see, that says the Gemara, that he is like someone who separates truma from produce that is not his, and it's also not from anyone else. It's going to be a lot like ownerless produce. And the Gemara is going to say, yet you're going to say in this Mishnah that his truma is not valid truma. So the idea is that you should conclude that when the Brisa excludes from somebody from separating truma from that which is not his, it refers only to one who separates truma from produce that is actually the property of his fellow, and not referring to ownerless produce. But the Gemara is going to try to deflect that. It's going to say, maybe we can say it differently. The idea, says the Gemara, is that one who is the one who separated the truma of the hektish produce, and perhaps it would be the original owner of the produce who did so while it was yet unconsecrated. And then, in that case, maybe the mission is dealing with the case of a Goan who consecrated truma that he owned. So what this deflection could be is, maybe the Mishnah does not demonstrate that the temple treasurer can separate truma from property belonging to hektish, and maybe we can't infer that a person can separate truma from ownerless produce. So again, we're getting into this twofold question that the Vilna Goan brings up to try to explain this. And let me rehash that real quick. The idea is, in short, like this, as the Vilna Goan, is this coming to deal with where somebody actually has to own the produce? And if that's the case, then you can't separate truma from either hefker property or from temple property because he's not the owner. Or maybe it's going to mean that, you can't separate truma from produce owned by another without his authorization. And in that case, then since the truma, is not belong to somebody else, maybe there's no one else that owns it, and so, he's precluded without getting authorization. In this case, he can't get authorization, but again, it means that there has to be somebody who's tied to it, and because nobody's tied to it, he can't do it. So there's two ways to look at this, and the Gemara is gonna try to explain that maybe this idea about the Goan coming and separating the truma before he consecrates it, maybe that's not the case. Maybe it's going to be more likely that this was separated by the temple treasurer, and then what do we do with this, right? So the Gemara says that Rabbi Hoshaya taught in a brisa elaborating that the Mishnah's ruling applies like this: whether one consecrates his tevel to hektish or truma later on and then separates it, or whether one consecrates his truma to hektish, that the Mishnah is going to refer to a case where the truma must have been separated by the temple treasurer, and we can therefore infer that a person can separate truma from ownerless produce, and it's not going to be like what Rabbi Hoshaya says, though. So Rabbi Idi said that the temple treasurer is considered like the owner of the property that was donated to hektish. In other words, the treasurer, says Rosh Cirilio, has jurisdiction over the hektish property, and it's going to be equivalent to the owner's jurisdiction over his own property. And so, because of this, says the Marafulda, he's going to be empowered to separate truma that was donated to hektish, and that's going to be from the produce of hektish, just like any other person is empowered to separate truma from produce he owns. And therefore, although you could infer that the Mishnah is talking about a temple treasurer separating truma from hektish produce, really doesn't give light on whether one can separate truma from ownerless produce. In other words, he's saying that hektish maybe is going to be a little bit different than ownerless, and this is not really going to give a final conclusion. And the Gemara is going to say that this is not in accordance with the view of Rabbi Yossi, because Rabbi Yossi says the temple treasurer is considered an outsider with respect to the ownership of consecrated items, and the Gemara is talking about a dispute between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Meir in a Tosefta in Shekalim 2:5, and that's dealing with the authority of the temple treasurer regarding shekalim donated to the temple for the purchase of communal offerings. And the idea is that there's a disagreement whether the temple treasurer has the same status as an owner in regard to hektish property that he's a trustee of, or whether he has the status of an outsider and he's just managing it. So again, this might look a lot like the trustee for an orphan. So Rabbi Meir is considering him like the owner, and Rabbi Yossi is considering him like an outsider. So according to Rabbi Idi's explanation, the Mishnah is talking about a temple treasurer being able to separate truma from hektish produce because he's considering him like an owner and not because one can separate truma from hefker produce. So in other words, this is saying that he has full control over it, and it's like he's an owner, therefore he can separate it. And so we're seeing here that there's a question of whether somebody can tithe ownerless tevel, and that really looks like it's going to be unresolved. So although the Yerushalmi here, according to Pnei Moshe, does not resolve this question, in Sachim 3:3, it does say that a person who declares his dough hefker cannot separate challah from it, and it follows that the same would hold true regarding truma. We know that also the Torah calls challah truma, so it should be noted that this discussion is dealing with someone who wants to separate truma from hefker produce, and whether that produce is going to be valid for separation. Many Achronim say that one is able to separate truma from his own produce, and also for the sake of exempting hefker produce. So the Gemara is going to look at the next part of the Mishnah tomorrow about what happens when a non-Jew separates truma from the produce of a Jew. Is that going to be valid truma or not? So why is this Gemara in here? Well, it's trying to point out there's a implicit difference between ownerless product and something that is owned by the temple. And something that is owned by the temple has an administrator, but something that is ownerless does not have an administrator. So that is going to, be a big issue about this right? So the Gemara is here because it's trying to point out this intrinsic difference in property rights. Have a great day.